Hi everybody, have your attention please. On behalf of the Law and Economics Society, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to a critique of law and economics today. Before we get started, please, if you have not, join our Facebook group. It's a way for us to sort of get the word out and another way for us to get funding from the school so we can put on excellent events like this and actually have more pizza than this time. So I apologize for those of you who were unable to get some food today. So our speaker today is the Korea Times Chair for Korean American Studies here at UCLA. He teaches civil procedure, communications law, and Asian American jurisprudence, and I'm sure most of you know him already, Professor Jerry Coffey.
So hey, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see former students, current students. It looks like a strange amalgam of this year's civil procedure, last year's civil procedure, and communications law, amongst other things. And it's great to have someone like Doug who takes a lot of initiative in changing the way that the intellectual community that is UCLA School of Law actually feels by actually taking initiative and making sure that interesting ideas are talked about, which is the point of a university. Some disclaimers. One, I am not an economist. I do not play one on TV. It doesn't prevent me from critiquing it. Two, I am more affiliated with the UCLA Critical Race Studies program, which I helped found and directed for many years, but this is not meant to be celebrity deathmatch. What I mean by that is, if you know something about schools of thought within law schools, you know that there are different camps, there are different factions, there are different ways to think and solve problems. And my goal here is actually not to have a parody where you have stylized straw men put up and taken down. Instead, I want to approach this audience principally as an audience of curious students, mostly, and not necessarily faculty. And I want to try to just approach the ideas with a prevailing intellectual attitude against smoke and mirrors. What I mean by that is I take all of us to be genuinely intellectually curious people, to want to try to figure out how things work and how to make the world better. Sometimes ideas help us doing that, sometimes ideas don't, and oftentimes we get confused about particular lines of thinking, and we fall into the trap of accepting various smoke and mirror devices as real analytic lenses that help us solve problems. And what I just want to be is, I guess, a thoughtful skeptic and share with you, almost in the way that I ran through these problems when I was sitting in your position as a law student, trying to figure out what economics might be, what law and economics might be, and how and why I thought some of it made sense to me and some of it seemed profoundly disturbed. So before I can critique it, in some ways I have to actually make an affirmative case of what law and economics actually is. I hope that the affirmative case of what law and economics might be has been made, at least in conjunction with other people, but spoken at the Law and Economics Society. It might be that you know very clearly what law and economics is. It might be that you have not much of a clue. I do have to describe briefly what it is I think it is so that I can critique it. Now, oftentimes when we talk about law and economics, people usually divide it into two different strands. One is descriptive, second is normative. You should understand the move, descriptive versus normative, which is often a way that law faculty, regardless of their schools of thought, right, solve problems and think about problems. So by descriptive we mean how things are. So it might be that law and economics helps describe how things are. What do I mean by things? It could be that law and economics helps describe what the law currently is. Oftentimes the thesis is that the common law, much less for statutory or even constitutional law, but the common law, the way that negligence tort doctrine was created, for example, the way that contract doctrines were created, that the common law somehow reflects an economic impulse to maximize something called efficiency. That's just how the law is. That's oftentimes the claim that law economists will make about the law. It might also be that it's describing persons. It might be describing persons as the following. That what human beings do, at least rational human beings do, is that they maximize something called utility. So if you're Homer Simpson and you get lots of preference satisfaction from eating donuts, then what humans do, what Homers do, is to eat a lot of donuts. Now, the person might not be a human being, it might be a firm, in which case what firms do is maximize something, not utility as much as profit, right? Greed. right? So this is just description. It's not a normative evaluation whether that's good or bad, right or wrong, should or should not do. It's just description. What do people do? They do these things. What is the law? The law maximizes efficiency. What do humans do? They maximize utility. What do firms do? They maximize profit. That's just the way of the world. That could be a descriptive claim. And oftentimes this idea, certainly about maximizing utility, is connected with rational choice theory. The question I will bring up later is it in fact empirically correct? If you're describing the world in a particular way, i.e. it is sunny outside, the question might be, well, is it in fact sunny outside? People might want to know. Now that's a descriptive component. The other part is, I guess, normative. And normative is, a fancy way to say how things should be. Not how things are, but how things should be. And the law is always interested in normative questions, right? It's not our job only to describe how things are, but how things ought to be. And we're not actually that embarrassed to ask those questions within law and policy. So what happens is that you take the descriptive claims and you change the is into a should. So in normative law and economics, you have claims like this. The law should maximize efficiency. Human beings, especially rational ones, aka consumers, should maximize utility. Firms that produce the widgets that we consume so that we can be happy should maximize profit. If we do all these things, good things will happen to us. Right? That's the value judgment. We might not be efficient. We might not be rational. We might not be maximizing. That's what we should be doing. That's the point. And we should design systems, including laws and institutions, so that we could maximize this stuff, that is a good thing to maximize. So that's what normative law and economics look like, and that's the structure that I want to try to think about. And of course, I'm going to ask again another question. Is it ethically or morally justified to maximize some or all of these things? And how do you know? So suppose that this is, again, I'm just starting with, again, just a skeletal description of what law and economics is. Let me try to figure out what's wrong with law and economics, or what I find troubling to understand. And I should say at the very beginning, like when I started law school and thought about things, it's not as if I disliked anything like, oh, you're using numbers to describe things, right? In sort of classical economic or econometric models, you're using numbers, and I dislike numbers because I went to law school and I'm all about feelings and qualitative stuff. No, I mean, I did science as an undergraduate. I did physics. I was plenty comfortable with numbers. I had no issues with the idea of expected utility functions. That wasn't my problem when I had some concerns about law and economics. And it wasn't as if I thought that somehow economics or economic analysis or sort of quantitative analysis or empirical approaches were somehow anathema. That's not what's driving my anxiety, but I did run into some smoke and mirrors. And so I'm going to start off with, I guess one could say, there are various threshold problems. So notice the structure of most law and economics, right? Most law and economics says something like this. X, being some agent, does or should maximize Y. So X could be a law, right, the common law. X could be a human being like you and me. It could be a firm. It could be an institution, right, the judiciary. And Y, unfortunately, is oftentimes not spelled out. You should maximize something. Something. It's efficiency. It's utility. It's profit. There's some maximand, this Y, that floats out there that everyone knows we should be maximizing, but you just toss out a word for it, oftentimes efficiency. I'm not quite sure what that Y ought to be. Moreover, there's a certain kind of slip. Sometimes I'm not sure what the unit of analysis is. Sometimes, are we talking about maximizing an individual's efficiency or maximizing society's efficiency? So this is like one of the bad Star Trek movies. Maybe this was actually a good Star Trek movie. This is when Spock sacrifices himself in some radiation chamber, and he gives the standard analysis, right? Needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Classic utilitarian analysis. Now, a lot of people think of utilitarianism as deeply selfish, but if you really take society as the relevant unit of analysis, it is the most altruistic and selfless thing that you could possibly do. You'd rather give up your lot. It makes plenty of sense. From society's perspective, you save 1,000, you give up one. It's one interesting life at Spock. That said, 999 you net out. On the other hand, if the unit of analysis is yourself, the individual, that's a pretty bad cost, death. So are we talking about maximizing a firm's profit or maximizing the economy's profit? Are we talking about maximizing your personal efficiency or everyone else's efficiency? Is it okay to produce negative externalities on everyone else as long as you don't get paid, you don't have to pay for it because it improves your bottom line? Or must you consider the pollution of the river that harms everyone else? Because you're concerned about society's bottom line. It seems that people will slip between those two at all times. So those are some of the concerns that I have about what is it that we're trying to maximize. I think the real question, and I'm going to run through a series of points. It's going to seem a little technical, but I think it's going to have a certain effect. That I intend. Jules Coleman, who is a philosopher and legal analyst at Yale, I think has written a brilliant article, and he runs through a series of arguments like this, right? So imagine the following. What is it am I supposed to maximize, right? If society or some firm, like we're supposed to maximize efficiency, right? Like what is it that we're supposed to maximize? If you went back to like what you studied in college and thought about John Stuart Mill, are we supposed to maximize utility? Like utilitarianism, we all remember that, right? We're supposed to maximize utility. But what is utility and how would you count it? It might be that utility is whenever you have a preference satisfied. Like I like donuts and I'm shoving donuts in my face, I'm being satisfied. That is increasing my utility function, right? And satisfaction of that utility function. The difficulty with this, from a philosophical perspective, is it's very hard to measure trade-offs on utility between two different people. So if you suffer because you have a hangnail and I benefit because I'm stuffing a donut in my face, how do you compare the pleasure and pain, the satisfaction of utility on my end because I'm stuffing donuts in my face, and the irritation on your end because you have a hangnail and or you're like maybe watching me stuffing donuts in my face and you find that awfully aesthetically unpleasant? How do you actually measure the difference? Is there some way we can take a machine and actually measure differences in utility? And philosophers have long struggled with the fact that this is actually quite difficult to do because you don't have a metric by which we can compare your pleasure and my pain. You can't just ask people, how do you know that the units are the same? Right? So it's actually a genuinely difficult philosophical problem. And so most economists talk about different types of efficiency. There's a form of efficiency called Pareto efficiency. A Pareto superior exchange is when there's an exchange and no one is hurt, but at least one person is helped. And so if I can't measure whether or not you're being hurt more than I'm being helped, sometimes you create a standard like this, Pareto efficiency. Any rule that is Pareto superior means that at least one person is benefited, but no one else is hurt by the adoption of the new rule. If no one else is hurt from a subjective perspective and at least one person is helped, you can say, hey, that's a better rule because no one is hurt and at least one person is helped. The problem is that doesn't exist in the real world. Whenever you pass a law, change a rule, there's always winners and losers, and this is essentially an academic solution, a Pareto efficient definition. So economists have gone to things like Kaldor-Hicks efficiency, and instead of saying no one can lose, they just say the following, right? We will call something efficient if the gains to the winners exceed the losses to the losers. It's effectively cost-benefit analysis. That's what they mean by efficient. They're saying as long as the new rule leads to bigger pluses for those who get pluses as compared to the minuses who get minuses, we're going to say it's a good rule. There's no obligation for the winners to compensate the losers. That's a distribution question. As long as the winners win more than the losers lose, we'll call that efficient. As long as the benefits exceed the costs, regardless of who benefits, and who actually suffers the cost, as long as B is greater than C, we'll just call that efficient. That's much more realistic because all new policies, all new legal regulations, all changes in some sense, always will have winners, new winners, and new losers. And so it's more realistic and not pie in the sky, but the problem again is that how do you know winners win more than losers lose? You again have to compare the experiences of two different human beings and ask, how much did you win, how much did you lose, and how did you experience it as such, which raises, again, this philosophical problem about the interpersonal comparison of, say, utility. At which point, people get confused and say, well, maybe we should just try to maximize welfare. welfare, not efficiency, not Pareto efficiency, not Kaldor-Hicks efficiency, just this thing called welfare. And what do we mean by welfare? It's just some concrete measure of something that we call a good. And it could be different kinds of good. It could be dollars, number of boats you have, number of summer houses. We could just measure welfare. But the problem with that is that you have all kinds of problems, and I realize that this is getting actually more complicated. But if welfare is just meant to be, well, did you have your preferences satisfied? Did you, i.e., get pleasure because you ate donuts? Did you suffer pain because you had a hangnail? Then you run into the same problem that we discussed before, which is the same problems with utilitarianism. Maybe we could do it just by measuring dollars, and that's basically what people have opted for. So if you really talk to economists, law and economists, when they say what we want to maximize is efficiency, oftentimes what they're talking about is maximizing wealth. They realize I cannot measure your pleasure and my pain and compare them, but I can measure your dollars against my dollars in US dollars dated today. And so instead of thinking about preferences, instead of thinking about pleasure and pain, instead of thinking about all those things, I'm just going to break it down to dollars, right? And what I'm going to do is adopt a policy that leads to more dollars being produced. That's the only way to make the problem tractable. Now think about that. The whole system is based on maximizing the production of dollars. Descriptively, the claim is that is how the law evolves and has evolved. Normatively is that that is the most attractive way to design society to maximize the production of dollars. I think that's a hard claim to make. There are lots of preferences that can't really be monetized in all kinds of ways. Think about everything that you love, everyone that you love. Oftentimes, it only credits people who have dollars. It's not about whether or not you really value it, but if you can't afford to pay it, you might be willing to pay $500 for it, but if you're not able to pay it, then we don't calculate it in the actual efficiency analysis. And again, it raises interesting questions about the moral foundation upon which you think our obligation to the world while we are alive is to maximize the number of dollars. So there are lots of threshold problems. The point I went through all of that is not to suggest by any means that somehow I've described it exactly right and or you should understand what I tried to describe to you. It's just that it's a hard question. What is it that law and economics is asking you to do? When they say casually, oh, it's efficient, we should seek efficiency, the immediate thing that you should ask is, what do you mean by efficiency? I'm not saying there are no answers. There are answers. It's just not my job to provide them when I'm not the law and economist. So when someone casually says, oh, that's the efficient solution, let's go with efficiency, you should pause and say, do you mean Pareto superiority or Pareto optimality? Do you mean Kaldor-Hicks efficiency? How do you run through the interpersonal comparison of utility problem? Are you maximizing welfare? How are you measuring welfare? Oh, you're maximizing wealth. Wealth just in dollars, right? At which point they'll say, I don't know how to answer those questions, but yeah, I think, okay, yeah, it's just efficient. Then we know where we're really at. Someone's just saying it's efficient, which means shorthand, they like it. So those are just the threshold problems. There's descriptive inaccuracy, which I am concerned about. So let's switch the unit of analysis to the person, not to the firm. So rational choice theory is tightly connected with how law and economics, classical law and economics, is currently practiced within the law school. And the assumption, the descriptive assumption, not normative, this is the right thing to do, the descriptive assumption is that persons, right, rational people behave in ways that maximize their expected utility. Unfortunately, there's overwhelming empirical evidence to the contrary that goes back at least to the 50s. Humans do not behave in ways that maximize their self-interest. Right? Herbert Simon demonstrated that we have all kinds of boundedness in information and processing. Like, you do not have perfect information on anything. Moreover, your brain sucks at processing risk. There's overwhelming evidence that your brain is a terrible probability calculus machine. It might have worked well if we were hunting saber-toothed tigers, right? It doesn't work so well in modern context. When you're thinking about the risks of background air pollution on your lung health in deciding whether to go to Los Angeles for a career or not. Really, it doesn't work. And that's why lots of other people, including people like Kahneman and Tversky, have suggested alternative theories, like prospect theory, instead of expected utility maximization, as a more accurate description of how human beings think and behave. So how problems are framed, where you start, whether you think of it as a gain or a loss, all of these things are incredibly important to predict how human beings actually behave, and they have nothing to do with a stylized expected utility calculation. And a lot of this stuff comes from doing actual experiments with people and realizing they don't behave like computers ought to behave under these functions, right? Human beings don't behave like rational maximizers of self-interest. Think about altruism. Again, we can play games about whether altruism exists and how you define it. But what I'm suggesting is that in the past, frankly, certainly in the past 4 decades, there's been a mountain of evidence from the economists, the cognitive psychologists, the social psychologists, the sociologists, to suggest that we do not, in fact, behave as rational maximizers of utility. So it just gets the description wrong. Now, if notwithstanding this mountain of evidence, you stake out a position, I don't care what the evidence says. I know that humans act as maximizers of their self-interest or maximizers of utility. And I know that the common law, right, this explains contributory negligence versus comparative negligence. I know that the common law maximizes efficiency. Notwithstanding the evidence, I know this is why firms actually give executive compensation at this rate, because it maximizes profit. If you just know that, notwithstanding the mountain of evidence to the contrary, then you're just staking out an ideological position that can't be falsified. And you just accepted essentially a religious tenet, which is hard to have a conversation about. There are normative problems also with certain practices of law and economics. And again, I appealed to this earlier. What is the moral foundation or basis to say that society should maximize dollars? Can costs and benefits always be reduced to dollars? How do you think about human dignity? How do you price human dignity? How do you price a poor person's desire for a Ferrari when that poor person is unable to pay for the Ferrari? Law and economics almost always ignores the fairness of distribution, right? So by distribution, I mean the distribution of some X amongst a bunch of people, right? And that X could be anything. It could be dollars, it could be income, it could be wealth, it could be opportunity, it could be respect, it could be any social primary good that Rawls defines, right? Law and economics is interested only in maximizing something, say dollars, or wealth. When you ask questions about fairness or distribution, they say, that's later. My job is to just grow the pie. You deal with splitting up the pie later in tax and transfer mechanisms. Of course, that later never comes in practice because none of us like to be taxed. Right? So everyone says, let's just grow the pie. We just want to maximize efficiency, welfare, this good stuff. We'll worry about distribution later, but that later seems to almost never come, which makes me concerned. There are ideological leanings, and this is, again, I'm giving a very stylized story. There are ideological implications of this way of thinking about the world and the law. Think about what the axioms are. We are rational. We don't do anything irrational like discriminate on the basis of gender or race. We are rational. The system is efficient. The law is efficient. If we have contributory negligence instead of comparative negligence, it is because it is efficient. There's nothing wrong We're rational, the system's efficient, market's clear, we're in equilibrium. Except for market failures that can be corrected by, say, something like antitrust law. All this leads to a model of what people would call system justification. There's nothing wrong, and if you don't like it, it's probably you, not the system. At which point you start wondering, wait, what's really going on? If you don't like the system, if you're skeptical about the system, if you have concerns about fairness within the distribution of goodies within the system, where are you to go within the logic of this form of law and economics? There are other miscellaneous problems, and I can go on for a while, but I won't. I'll give just a couple. Economics often thinks, right, and this goes back now, I'm going back from dollars to satisfaction of preferences. They take, in economic analysis, they take your preferences as a given, right? So if you like chocolate ice cream and I like vanilla ice cream, there's no conversation on why do you like chocolate ice cream. I want to take away that preference. I want to give you chocolate ice cream at the cheapest marginal cost possible because I want you to be like Homer Simpson and stuffing chocolate ice cream in your mouth to make yourself happy. That's what an economy ought to do. That's what the law ought to do. So we don't contest preferences. We assume them to be given exogenous to the system. But we know that's not how preferences work, right? How do we know this? It's because I like that stuff, kimchi. Now, it turns out I'm in LA. A lot of you like it. Why do I like it? I was exposed to it as a little kid in Korea. We know that early exposure, repeat exposure, leads you to like something. Whether you're exposed to something, including food, is a function of culture. Culture is created by, if nothing else, information which is mediated through communications industries, right? So economics and the market structure allow you to be exposed to or not exposed to lots of things which then set your preferences. And if you think, I don't understand the kimchi part, I think about the leg warmers. You remember who you are. At some point, you're not that much younger than I am. At some point, some of you wore leg warmers and thought it was cool. Is that coming back now? I don't know. But culture, I could have done like a thin polyester, thin woven tie for the gentleman, I guess. But there is clearly, right, whether people are willing to pay a lot of money and wear leg warmers to high school when they are not dancers, right? Whether that happens day in and day out is a function of what? Where did that preference come from? Like, think of the ridiculous amounts of money that you pay for some of the clothes that you have that are functionally no better than the knockoffs that people who are less fortunate than you would be using. Where does the brand come from, right? And to suggest that preferences are not connected with actually the economy and therefore invite a certain kind of circularity, right? Is the market supposed to satisfy preferences? Absolutely. Where do the preferences come? From the market. At which point you have a circle. And anytime you see this kind of circularity, you should stop and say, wait, you can't run a system that's based on a deep circularity. There's other kinds of stuff I could talk about, but I'll stop there. There are also interesting boundary problems, right? So sometimes when you talk to economists, they recognize almost all the time that most things ought to be decided in market terms. Decide what's efficient, and think about it as an economist would. What's efficient? What's the efficient distribution? What's the efficient rule? How do we decrease transaction costs? Yeah. And yet, sometimes things clearly live in politics land, not market land. So think about it. Like, why can't you sell your vote? Like, you don't really want to vote. You're busy studying. There's a lot of stuff. There are all those crazy propositions, and you feel like, do I just randomly check stuff? I have to like search on the web, at least look at the LA Times editorial record. I'm like, I'm busy. Someone will pay $100 for it. Why not just sell your vote? You're giving the vote to the person who values it most as measured by willingness and ability to pay. Why is that not the efficient solution? Let's suppose someone who's really wealthy and wants to gain satisfaction by killing a lot of people. Why do you let him do it? Because he's willing to pay a lot more than the victims are willing to pay not to be killed because they're not able to pay because they're poor people. Why not allow it? There are lots of things we immediately think, oh no, that's not a market question. That's a political question. That's about right and wrong. We would never let the market decide that question. But you have to ask yourself how and why we know this. So when I teach communications law, I deal with internet pornography, right? Think about that. Pornography is a widget. It's created by an economy. Many people like to consume it. What should a pro-market approach to pornography be? Deliver pornography of the highest quality at the lowest price as fast as possible to all those who would consume it. And if there's a little bit of social stigma, make sure they can do it anonymously. Thus, broadband internet, right? That should be the goal. If you're a pro-free market, should you not be lobbying constantly to get government regulation out of the way? Indecency policy, obscenity policy, what is that? We take preferences as given. You might like this, you might not. You might like chocolate ice cream, you might like it with the cherry on top. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Whatever your preferences are, I love you because you're a sovereign consumer, and I want to get you what you want as cheaply and effectively as possible. That's my job. That's what the market should do. That's what the government should do. And yet, we spend unbelievable amounts of resources making sure that you hear or don't hear certain words, that you hear or don't see certain images. And we invoke a rhetoric of politics and not economics. How and why? Who made that choice? And can you use economic analysis to decide where that boundary line ought to be? And if you cannot use economics to answer that question, then what superset of ideas must you turn to when all you can think about is maximizing efficiency? All right. So I've been kind of a downer on this. So then talk is, it's much easier to critique, right? Anyone can, smart critique and say, oh, that's stupid, that's stupid. What are the alternatives? I'll give you some alternatives, right? And again, and tell me what you think about them. This is meant to be a genuine engagement with what you think. So think about it. I'm more understood to be part of critical race theory and the critical race studies program here than law and economics. But think about how many people, if you know anything about critical race theory, and you might know absolutely nothing about it, but if you know anything about it, think about what the bum rap could be for something like people who do race work. Here's the stylized stereotype bum rap, and it looks something like this. You know what critical race theory is? It's a bunch of angry colored people who see racism everywhere. They whine a lot, they accuse a lot, can't think themselves out of a paper bag, and that's why they blame it on racism all the time. That's the bum rap. Not that any of you have it or think this, but that's the bum rap that race theory, ethnic studies, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of programs such as this actually have. But notice, right, really interestingly, right, a couple things, right? So if you wanted to formulate, right, continuing this bum rap or this stylized stereotype of the school of thought, think about how you could translate the descriptive and normative claims. The descriptive claim could be something like this. Law and society are always racist, descriptively. Like, no matter what you see, it's racist. The LSAT, it's racist. Admissions at UCLA, racist. The way I'm being called on, it's racist. This lecture, racist. Right? That is how you could see it, right? Descriptively. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just racist. Right? That could be the descriptive claim. The normative claim would be just put a negative sign before racist. Law and society should be anti-racist. Right? That's the normative claim of critical race theory, according to this stylized bum rap. Right? And then, if you hear this, you would be very angry, and you would critique. You're saying, what do you mean by racist? Where's your proof? The facts don't show it. Come on, you're being ideological. You're always saying it's race. Come on. He just wasn't that good. Not everything has to be race. Don't play the race card all the time. Why is it always race? Why not class? Why not like Bruins versus Trojans? Let's pick something different besides race. Right? But note the structural similarities between what I've tracked as a stylized form of law and economics discourse and a stylized form of critical race discourse. Not to suggest that there are always equivalences, but I think this might be educational, right? If law and economics says descriptively, the law is efficient, notwithstanding all the evidence to the contrary, that's interesting. If law and economics say that human beings, right, are rational maximizers of utility, notwithstanding all the evidence to the contrary, that's interesting. How is that any different from saying the law is racist and human beings are racist all the time, right? What if you find evidence to the contrary? No, I don't think that people are racist all the time. What do you mean by racism? Well, what do you mean by efficiency? It's like, well, you know, racism, it's like disparate treatment and disparate impact. Wait, disparate treatment and impact? Does it matter whether unintended or not? Well, do you mean Pareto or Kelder or Hicks? Does it matter whether or not you actually have to give benefits from the winners to the losers? I don't know. Where are the smoke and mirrors? They're everywhere. It's not on one side. It's not on any one side. And I can do this with every school of thought that is prevalent within American legal culture. So you often hear about behavioral law in economics, which is the second iteration of law in economics, which is far more empirically minded. Leading people include Joel Sunstein-Thaler, our own Russell Kropkin, as well as Langelbert out of Georgetown. And this term, it's called behavioral law in economics, is to infuse the law in economics tenets with deeper empiricism. It recognizes what cognitive psychology has taught us, that we have bounded rationality, that we have bounded willpower, that we have bounded self-interest. And what they've done is, with the advantage of the materials from the social scientists as well as the natural scientists, they create a laundry list of biases or processing errors that we tend to make in non-random ways. And what behavioral law economists do is they recognize these biases. There could be 10 more, 10 less. You could clump them in different ways and say, given the fact that we, for example, have optimism bias, like all of you think you'll be in the top 10% of the class when you accept UCLA, right? That kind of optimism bias. Given that fact, should we do something different to counter that, to make sure that you're not surprised when that turns out to be not true for 90% of you? Now, oftentimes, behavioral law in economics is oftentimes, in my views, very minor in its effect, right? They accept mostly rational choice theory. They accept few tweaks or biases based on some of the cognitive and psychological literature and suggest very minor incremental changes on policies. Here's a school of thought, and I'll finish with this, behavioral realism, that is a little bit more radical, but continuous with it. So not only from the cognitive side that focuses on kind of how we deal with probabilities, but from the memory literature, from the stereotyping literature, you can find out from social cognition a whole bunch of additional biases, right? That hot cognition, like if you meet me and I hand you a warm cup of coffee while we're going up the elevator versus an iced tea, right? You have statistically significantly different reactions about whether or not you on average will think I have a warm personality versus a cold personality. Because we're metaphor dopes. We hold the hot cup of coffee in our hand and we think warm, right? That's how silly our brains can be. And so I've done a lot of work on implicit stereotypes and implicit attitudes, right? Implicit biases, evidence that suggests that notwithstanding all the sincere commitments that you have about being fair and square, that you have junk in your heads in the form of stereotypes, associations between certain social categories and truth statements, right? So when you look at me, what do? You put me into the category of Asian, right? You don't, maybe Korean. You don't say Oriental because you know better, right? So you put me into a category through visual inspection and my last name, right? Mostly visual inspection, frankly. And you put me into a category. Once you put me into the category Asian, what fires, right? Attitudinally, it's stuff in your gut, like or dislike, approach, avoid, hot, not hot, maybe hot if he or she, but he's a he, so no. There is a gut reaction, and there's also, right, stereotypes. More likely than not that he's good at math. More likely than not that he played violin at the age of 6. More likely than not that he's a martial artist. More likely than not that he can't parallel park. 3 out of 4 of those things are true. Regardless of whether you know them or agree with them, the argument is there's evidence that there's junk in your head that changes your interactions immediately, right? And given that increasing evidence of implicit bias, a lot of really interesting psychologists, world-class scientists, mind scientists, and I have been pushing forward a very simple model which will seem quite innocent. And all that I want to do it, and then I'll connect the dots to just make sure that people see why this is on point. All that we seek is to make sure that we got our facts right in some sense. We want to identify new scientific consensus, right, within the mind sciences, right? So when scientists document the existence of implicit bias and their predictive validity and impact in the real world, when scientists document the significance of the situation and how we behave, that's something that's really interesting. Then we should spot gaps between the folk psychology that is always embedded in the law and the new consensus. The folk psychology in the law always assumes that we are completely rational, self-aware actors, when the truth is much more complicated. We don't, in fact, behave that way, right? Folk psychology is everywhere. Think about criminal law. Think about intent, right? Think about defense. Think about necessity. Folk psychology is everywhere because you cannot have law without a theory of how human beings behave. But when the scientists demonstrate that our folk psychology embedded in the current law is deeply inaccurate, I want the law to take that into account. I want either the law to change or to fess up why it cannot. So if we think we are already colorblind, gender blind, religion blind, X blind, but the evidence suggests, probabilistically speaking, not so much. Should the law respond to that fact, or should we stay anchored to our ideological commitment, thinking that, oh no, we are colorblind and that's just how I feel it? If the facts get messy, should the law respond, or should it stick its head collectively in the sand like an ostrich and refuse to see what empiricists have found? And I think that's a hard claim. If you want to do it, you must at least be transparent about it. You must tell the world why, notwithstanding what we found to be true, we will behave otherwise, under false assumptions. At least transparency would be necessary. This is meant to be an only weakly normative theory. It's really just to promote reality over fantasy, not make stuff up, and to avoid a mystifying self-deception. I don't want hypocrisy. If you think the world works this way and that's why you pass the law, and then you find out that's not the way the law works, then you should either change things, right, or give reasons why you can't change things. But you should not assume you got it right before when you now know you got it wrong. How does this all connect up? Well, it turns out that it challenges fundamentally like the models of human behavior. If human beings are supposed to behave rationally, right, in ways that maximize their self-interest, right, as measured by, again, utility, dollars, whatever, why are there countless examples from laboratories and experiments where people will do just crazy things, right? Like there's a great experiment that one of my co-authors, Majan Banaji, did with some business law people. I'll give you the sense of the experiment and you can get it, right? If I asked you, how much would you pay for the 4th USB port on a netbook? You're like, 4th USB port? I don't know. I mean, I don't think you can use 2 of them. What's a USB port? I mean, do I need one? I mean, I don't know, 15 cents, $1, $15? It turns out you actually can't ask people directly, how much would you pay for the 5th HDMI port on a 48-inch TV that uses edge light LED backlight? You can't ask people because they don't really know. The only way you can ask people is basically this or this. I'll take this. This or this. I'll take this. This or this. I'll take this. And what you do is you ask them a whole series of these questions, slightly tweaking the factors, including the price, and then you stitch back together what must be the implicit preferences of the people underlying. And this is how marketing is oftentimes now done. through that kind of analysis, using that kind of analysis, what they did was they took a bunch of college students and said, it's a trivia game, right? You have to answer, it's a trivia contest, right? It's College Bowl, right? And you can pick, here's the profile of your teammate, including information like essentially IQ score, and other kinds of information, prior experience with the College Bowl game, and what they included was a picture of the person. And psychologists are devious. What they did was they took the same picture, but they morphed it. They made one woman really fat, right? We're talking like probably 110 pounds overweight, right? Or what would be considered average. You ask people explicitly, does the weight of your teammate matter? Weight? Who cares? It's College Bowl. I mean, everyone's a geek. I mean, no, I want the right answer. No one cares about weight. But if you actually do the calculations, you have people trading off up to 10 IQ points just to be a partner with someone who's thinner. I can give you other examples about potential jobs they could take in this city or that city, where people will trade off like $4,000 up to 10% of their annual salary to work for a white man instead of a woman on these calculations. You might think, oh, but those are two, who knows, those 2 studies, I didn't see the studies, whatever. And again, this is all meant to be suggested, right? You can't possibly be persuaded by 2-sentence descriptions of studies where you should be able to drill holes on any particular analysis. But what I'm suggesting is there's too much evidence against our so-called rationality for us to think confidently that all will go according to plan through a rational logic that maximizes utility for the greatness of this nation. There's too much evidence to the contrary. And what I'm suggesting is that we adopt schools of thought, and again, the real question really is about empiricism, and that's what I'm going to put up on the table, right? Do we want to be serious empiricists about this? So the takeaways. 1, don't be intellectually smug. Really. No matter how smart you are, no matter what school of thought you identify yourself with, really, you're not all that. You aren't. That goes for me, that goes for all of us. Number 2, I don't like mystification. Don't throw around terms that you don't know. Just because you know a little bit more than everyone else, don't start throwing around terms and using them. I don't care whether they're talking about efficiency or equilibria, Nash equilibria, or whether they're talking about, the social constructiveness of race. I don't care. Either way, you're going to use the term, you're held accountable for. Don't talk smack, basically. Just don't do it. Right? If you don't know what you're talking about, own it. Figure it out or shut up. Against mystification or maybe mythology, right? If you're going to design entire policies based on firm ideological assumptions that have been really pushed back on by what we consider to be the gold standard by which we solve disputed questions of fact, this thing that we call science. Now, we could have a long conversation about whether science is all that either, right? Science is deeply imperfect. How questions get asked, why certain questions get funded, why certain questions get accepted as truth. All of that, we can go hours on that. But don't make stuff up. And if people do not maximize their expected utility, stop acting as if they do. Finally, we should check against motivated reasoning. We always think things that happen to benefit our self-interest. It's easy to do. We do it all the time. We do it so effortlessly that we never think about it. When we try to make merit decisions, it happens to be the person who kind of looks like us, acts like us, smiles like us, will eat dinner like us, because it pumps us up. So I'm in favor of self-awareness. Now, this sounds now like a 10-step program, which is a little bit beyond the call of the question about law and economics, and I've gone on pretty long. But what I'm trying to suggest is when I was a student like you, just trying to figure out what the universe of pantheon of ideas were, I heard all these buzz phrases. Oh, I'm law and society. I'm law and economics. I'm behavioral law and economics. I'm an empiricist. I'm a critical race theorist. And I thought, who are these people and what are their superpowers? Can you shoot jet fire out of your hands? Can you fly? Are you clairvoyant? What are your superpowers? Let me find out, because they're interesting. Because with those powers, I can help save the world. At which point you find out when you start unpacking, right? But a lot of people will talk a lot. It's not clear they have superpowers. They assume they do, and they'll talk confidently as if they do. But the more I unpacked, the less confident I was sure that they knew what they were talking about. And certainly I didn't know what they were talking about. Which forced me to say, like, I don't know anything. Which is where I'm leading you now. Like, I don't know if any of this stuff is right. But what did I do? I am not a law and economist, and yet I come to an event sponsored by a Law and Economics Students Association. I've studied it enough to be conversant with some of the problems. I give it that kind of respect. How often does that happen across other aisles, right? And what is the nature of the university and the way we think about things and the smugness with which we interact with each other that make it that kind of interaction so uncommon? Those are larger questions about what it means to be really a student of ideas. And I do think that's what this association, as currently led by these guys over here, my former civil procedure students, are thinking about. And that I find attractive. And that's why I'm glad to be here. Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes.
If anybody has any questions, please.
And you don't have to ask questions. You could leave. Mr. Klein, yeah.
We need a truth squad here. You have a lot of colleagues, including me, who have found economics extremely useful over the years in a variety of ways, telling us, for example, why some taxes are better than others, why antitrust law is a good thing, why we need to regulate certain kinds of monopolistically tendency industries, and so on. I could go on. You concede, and I think all of us would concede all of these defects, and we would say, sure, we have to deal with all this. But it seems to me that you haven't given sufficient credit to what economics has done favorably despite these problems.
So I'll take that as a completely valid criticism. This is in part why I started. Like, I hope the affirmative case in favor of law and economics has been made to this kind of audience. I know that you couldn't have possibly attended every lunch or been exposed to that. But you're right. Especially, I mean, as a descriptive matter, when I think about how to think about horizontal market consolidation and antitrust law, if I don't have economics as a tool, I don't know how to think about that problem. When I want to think about price rate regulation, right, and when I think about how to set price caps, I don't know how to think about that besides economics. And I want to make sure that I give credit to economic thinking, right? Do I think somehow that the Fed should be run by people who never took an economics class? No, not by any stretch of the imagination. And so I will take that criticism, and I want to give as much credit, and I assume that in the course of programming, you'll see lots of examples where people will take lots of credit for the ways in which economic thinking about legal problems is deeply beneficial and helps us lead society to a better path. That said, my job is to give a critique, and the critique is in part driven by what I think, and you can tell me, Bill, if you disagree. There's a certain kind of imperialist logic to economic analysis that has dominated American legal education and legal thought for easily 3 decades, it seems to be. And people have thought that that is the way, default way and most powerful way to solve almost all problems. And then when someone asks, well, what about distribution? They say, well, we'll deal with that later in tax and transfer. And so it's my hedge against what I consider to be imperialism in the field of ideas. Now, you could take an evolutionary psychology approach and say, well, you know, the only reason why it's succeeding is because in the competition, in the natural selection for ideas, it must be the most adaptive. But again, most adaptive isn't always true. Right? So I'll own it, and again, I'm sure you'll hear good enough things about what economics will do. And again, maybe I did provoke a celebrity death match when I didn't intend to. Use tools when they make sense, but make sure you know their limitations.
Well, you mentioned a number of different, like, I guess, sub-disciplines perhaps, like behavioral economics and law economics and CRS. And so I was wondering if you had, like, recommendations for people who are interested in any of these, like where to look, classes.
So we don't have a history of intellectual. So we don't have, generally speaking, a jurisprudence class that's regularly taught, or even it would be like an intellectual history class, and that prevents you from exposure of them. And there are different. There are some textbooks, right, that are like casebooks or readers that will pull together, oftentimes at pretty poor quality levels, different kinds of schools of thought. Here's an exposure to economics, here's some exposure to critical race theory, here's some exposure to law and society, here's some exposure to legal realism. But you have to do your own work. So there are some jurisprudence-like books that are like case books that do this. But I can't give you one source that does this best. It behooves you to actually contact your teachers, right? You should kind of know where your teachers line up in terms of the way that they solve problems. And from that, you can say, like, I hear that you do this, right? You're an empiricist. So what is it that you do, and how might you describe your work?
I have a question. How would the law explain sentencing? So like criminal sentencing, right?
Yeah.
Let's say you steal $300, you go to prison for 10 years. First you said that sounds like a stupid decision, right? So the person is not acting rationally. But then when the law tries to sentence that person, how do you decide if that 10 years is worse? What's the difference in sentencing for 10 years, 11 years, or 12 years? How do you measure the differences?
Well, I think different people think about it differently, and then people have different models when they think about the right way to do sentencing. Some of it is retribution, some of it is deterrence. But a lot of people, like if you think about sentencing guideline structures, it is the pinnacle of kind of bureaucratic engineering to set both incentives, right, and deterrence at just the right level. So I think people do assume that individual human beings are amenable to different carrots and stick approaches, and they set it in a way that they think will get the end result. Now, often it's based on heroic assumptions that have never been tested in all kinds of ways, but I think that is what people assume. If you ask someone who's created the federal sentencing guidelines, did you do this rationally? They would say, of course, yes. We try to set it that either maps conceptions of retribution, right? This is the offense to society, and so it must scale in some sense. This is very evil, so we must punish a great deal, and or we need this for deterrence. But again, we know that there are lots of disparities, including like, how we deal with powder and crack cocaine, and whether or not the actual pharmacological differences in those substances justify the difference in punishment, which is, I think, a hard case to make.
Yeah. So it seems like if you did want to deter someone, you're assuming that they're behaving rationally, and they'll use that as a deterrent. But if they're not behaving rationally in the first place, how does that deterrent work?
Yeah, so it's not either or, but yes, that's oftentimes the case. Like think about antitrust treble damages, right? The reason why we treble the damages theory is the idea that it's really hard to get caught, and so when you get caught, we'll multiply by a factor of 3. Well, that only makes sense if you think it's like you get caught 1/3 of the time as compared to every other kind of federal violation. And of course, that again, like who's done the study and giving you the statistics to say the matching number is 3. Of course, we don't really demand that kind of precision, but we do have that. So we do presume, if you assume, right, a banal form of law in economics sounds just like this. People are subject to incentives, and the law should manipulate incentives to get people to behave the way they should. If that's all you're saying, who would disagree with you? Of course, people are amenable to incentives. It's just that how strongly you believe that amenability to incentives is driven by expected utility calculation, right? Some people might say, you know what, a death penalty is not going to do that much for certain kinds of drug crimes. Because you know what? There's a death penalty currently on the streets. Because if you're in that line of business, people will shoot at you, right? The fact that the state might try to execute you after 3 rounds of habeas is really not going to change your utility calculus much. It's a dangerous line of work, right? And yet we still have a particular theory about it. And again, I think the empirical analysis about whether death penalty actually leads to particular deterrence, I think, is deeply controversial. But it's not, by no means is it overwhelmingly recognized that adding the capital punishment penalty ends up deterring all kinds of crimes. I think we're done.
Yes, thanks a lot, everybody.